Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery. This week's case has been recommended in the comments of every single video that I've uploaded in the past few months. And honestly, it's not the kind of case that I would usually cover, but perhaps it's finally time for me to talk about it, seeing as you guys want to see it so badly. So this is the story of the Menendez brothers. Going into this case, I didn't think I knew it at all. The name didn't ring any bells, but I soon realised that I have heard about this case before, and you probably have too. It's one of the most notorious true crime cases in American history. This is a mystery unlike any others I've covered on this channel because there's no doubt over who the guilty party is in this story. The question lies in the motive. At what point is a murder justified, if it ever can be at all? So our story is going to start with Jose Menendez. He was born in Cuba and grew up there, and he was known as a pretty strong character, known as the neighbourhood bully. And the other kids were pretty scared of him. His father was a well-known football player and his mother was a successful swimmer. And they weren't hugely famous or super rich, but they were well known around Cuba, and Jose and his sister had a good childhood. Everything that they wanted was provided for them. That is until the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and Jose's entire life was uprooted. So age 16, he moved to the United States to live with his cousin, and he eventually attends the Southern Illinois University, which is where he meets his future wife, Mary Louise Anderson, also known as Kitty. The two of them married in 1963, with Jose just 19 years old and Kitty 2 years his senior at 21. They moved to New York City, where Jose washes dishes for work, and he transfers to Queens College, where he gets his accounting degree. And then after college, he begins work with a prestigious accounting firm, impressing every single person that he came into contact with. He was remembered as being strong-headed, he knew what he wanted, and he was ruthless when it came to getting it. But he was also charming and charismatic, and generally people liked him as much as they feared him. And this is the kind of reputation he had for his entire life. Eventually, Jose impresses another company so much, he was basically doing their books for them, that they wanted to hire him themselves, and that's what they did. And within 3 years at this new company, he's president of it. By the age of 35, he was executive vice president in charge of all US operations at Hertz, the car company, which was owned by a corporation called RCA Corporation. Just a year later, he's put in charge of RCA's record division. He becomes Chief Operating Officer. He was earning $500,000 a year. And then he moves to another job at Carolco Pictures, and he turns the entire company around in months. They go from earning nothing to being very successful. Jose was literally living the American dream. He moved to America to become successful, and he made it happen for himself. Now, Kitty Menendez, formerly Kitty Anderson, played the role of the attentive wife to the strong, successful businessman. Kitty was born in suburban Chicago, and she had a pretty tough life growing up. Her father was abusive, her mother was pretty much just like checked out, completely unresponsive, and therefore she rarely spoke of her past, possibly from the shame of it. She met and married Jose quickly, despite both their families being very much opposed to their marriage. They were too young, they were from different cultures, but they wanted to marry, and so they did. In the early days of their marriage, Kitty was actually an elementary school teacher, but she gave her job up after giving birth to her sons, Lyle and Erik, and she became a full-time homemaker, full-time mother. From the outside, it looked like the Menendez family lived the perfect life. They had money, they had status. Jose worked his way up the corporate ladder, whilst Kitty looked after the home and the kids. The perfect American family in those times. It seemed pretty idyllic, but you never really know a situation until you're in it. The couple's first son was Joseph Lyle Menendez, who was known by his middle name Lyle, and he was born on January 10th, 1968, and shortly after the family moved to New Jersey, where 3 years later Erik Menendez is born on November 27th, 1970. The boys both attended Princeton Day School, which was a private school for children from pre-kindergarten through to the 12th grade. When the boys were 12 and 19, they were started on a regimen that was designed to turn them into tennis stars. They were going to be successful athletes. Perhaps Jose and Kitty realised that they were never going to be great academic successes, and therefore they needed another path to their success in life. They were the best tennis players at the country club, a fact Jose revelled in. Their tennis coach would later say that Jose Menendez was one of the worst ambitious tennis parents that he'd ever come across. The boys would have to practice every single day before school and after school and all day on weekends. There weren't any days off, including Christmas Day. But the boys were expected to be excellent in every aspect of their life. They were expected to have their father's charisma, to be able to discuss culture and politics. They were expected to be able to impress everyone, and that's a lot of pressure to have. So Jose was a perfectionist. Everything had to be perfect, including his sons. And as they grew older, Jose had control over who the boys dated and who they were friends with. The family had a reputation that the boys had to live up to. They had to uphold this reputation, and therefore they had to be seen hanging with the right kind of people. Jose was the definition of the rich, pushy parent who thought his sons reflected them as a family. But whilst Jose was seen as pushy, he wasn't seen as abusive. Nobody ever saw him strike or hurt his boys in any way. And friends and relatives reported that he would frequently hug his boys to show them affection. In 1986, the family moved to Calabasas, California. So they moved across the country from New Jersey to California to a beautiful 5-bedroom house on 14 acres of land. The rich scene in Calabasas was completely unlike what it was on the West Coast, where people were less likely to show off about their wealth. On the West Coast, people were most likely old money and they were more private about their wealth. But in California, it was all about opulence and showing off about all this money you had. In 1988, shortly after moving to Calabasas, Erik and Lyle were teenagers still, or I think Erik was around 17 and Lyle would have been around 1920. They become involved in a burglary and a grand theft. Some sources say it was both of the boys, some say it was just Erik, so I can't be 100% sure here, but I'll tell you the story regardless. So Erik and Lyle had fallen in with a group of wealthy boys at school who were ultimately just pretty bored with their lives. This is a group of teenagers who had everything they could ask for in life. They didn't need money, they were so wealthy they'd never had to ask for anything. The burglaries that they committed were simply thrill crimes, and they weren't inconsequential either. Money and expensive jewellery was taken from the homes of neighbours until eventually they get caught. And Jose was furious that his boys were tied to these crimes, but he wasn't furious for the crimes per se. He was furious about the fact that they got caught. How stupid could they be to get caught? Jose takes all of the stolen goods to the police station and he does punish the boys accordingly. But he uses his influence, his money, with the police to ensure that Erik never had to serve jail time. Jose had decided that Erik, who was underage at the time, would have to be the one to take the fall for both boys, because he didn't want to affect Lyle's college admission. Jose visited every single home that had been robbed and wrote them checks for the price of their missing goods to ensure that they didn't follow up with the police. Most children would have got prison time for this. Erik and Lyle were made to attend a psychiatrist, a Dr. Azouz. So Erik began to attend Calabasas High School and Lyle enrolled at Princeton University. Now Lyle's grades were nowhere near good enough to get him into Princeton, but due to his tennis skills and a sizable donation from Jose, he was accepted. But he really struggled at Princeton. During his freshman year, he was placed on academic probation for poor grades and poor attendance, and he was eventually suspended after just one term for a year after being accused of plagiarism in Psychology 101, something that even his father's name and money couldn't save him from. Even after Lyle was suspended from Princeton, his father refused to let him move back to California with the family because he didn't want anybody knowing that his son was no longer attending the school. So instead, Lyle goes travelling with his new fiancée for 3 months before settling back in at Princeton and eventually continuing with his studies, where his fiancée worked as a waitress. He returned home to California during the summer. Now by this summer, Jose had decided to leave the Calabasas area and the family moved to a new home in Beverly Hills. Erik moving schools to Beverly Hills High School alongside this. They moved to another huge, beautiful home, and from the outside, it seemed like this family did live the perfect life. They had money, an attentive mother, a successful father, and 2 popular, good-looking, athletic sons. But appearances can be very deceiving. Kitty actually really struggled with her mental health, with reports that she was suicidal. Her therapist said that she talked of killing herself and the depression and the anger that she felt. She talked about how she would try to commit suicide and talked of previous attempts. It was pretty serious. Jose had apparently been having an 8-year-long affair with a woman in New York, and he had been having another affair with a woman in LA, and he had driven Kitty to despair. According to her therapist, she saw suicide as the best way to get back at her husband, and apparently the effect that it would have had on her children were just a secondary thought. It's been reported that at one point she said that she wished her children had never been born. But Kitty refused to divorce Jose because appearances were important, and Jose was a powerful man, and it's reported that Kitty lived in fear of him alongside their sons. The 3 men in her life were entirely dominant. Her entire life revolved around them, and they paid very little attention to her. And allegedly as well, she had a pretty bad drinking problem alongside this. And reportedly as well, Kitty very much disapproved of Lyle's lifestyle choices. She really sort of zoned in on Lyle and really disapproved of what he was doing with his life. He was kind of known as a bit of a playboy. He always had different girls hanging off his arms, apparently Victoria's Secret models. And Kitty hated this, but she also hated that Lyle got engaged to this older fiance, and she said that this older fiance just wouldn't be a suitable fit for the family, and still she disapproved of Lyle's choices. Her therapist said that she very much sort of fixated on Lyle during these sessions. And things were about to get even worse on the evening of August 20th, 1989. Jose and Kitty were sitting in their den in their Beverly Hills house just watching TV when they were both brutally murdered by gunshots. 21-year-old Lyle and 18-year-old Erik were out that evening, they said. They'd gone to see the new Batman movie, and they'd gone to a food festival afterwards and had planned to meet a friend after that. But Erik had forgotten his ID, so they stopped at home on their way to grab it. And as soon as they walk into the home, they come across a crime scene. Both of their parents dead and bloody on the floor. Lyle calls 911.
Beverly Hills emergency?
Yes, police.
What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
What? Who? Are they still there?
Yes.
The people...
No.
Were they shot?
Hey, man, dude.
Were they shot?
Yes.
They were shot?
Yes.
102 response. 723 North Elmore.
What happened? Hey, stand up,
I have a hysterical person on. We're trying to get things further. Other units responding. Is the person still there?
What happened? We have units around. What happened? Who shot who?
I don't hear anything. I just came home.
You came home and found who shot?
Mom and Dad. You know if they're still in the house, the people that did the shooting.
Get away from him. Okay. Hey, let me talk to Erik. Who is the person that was shot?
My mom and my dad.
Your mom and dad?
My mom and my dad.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, we're on our way over there with the ambulance.
Okay, I gotta go.
Okay.
And after this, the police and the ambulance soon arrive at the scene. Jose had been shot in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun, and Kitty had clearly been awakened by the shots and had got up off the sofa, shot in both legs as she ran towards the hallway away from her attackers. This caused her to slip in her own blood and fall to the ground. She's then shot several times while she's on the floor in her arm, her chest and her face. Both Jose and Kitty were shot in the kneecaps, something that's often connected with organised crimes. Because of this, police suspected that the crime had been perpetrated by mobsters, the mafia. In the first reports, they said that it was likely to be a gangland-style killing. Lyle and Erik are questioned for hours by the police the following day, but they're distraught about the murder of their parents and are soon let go. The police never perform any analysis on the brothers to find any gunshot residue. Neither do they check either of the boys' cars. If they had, they would have found the guns that they used to murder their parents, and the boys covered themselves in gunshot residue. They'd murdered their parents. First, there were the memorial services for Jose and Kitty though, held both in California and in New Jersey, where the boys speak about their loss. But after that, things just pretty much seem to go back to normal for the boys, or maybe even past the point of normal, because all of a sudden, Lyle and Erik had unlimited access to this huge family fortune. Erik moves into an apartment in Marina del Rey, moves out of the Beverly Hills home, and decides to devote himself to his tennis. He intends to break into the pro tennis ranks. He also travels back and forth from Princeton and goes to Mexico on holiday. He is always out of the country. And Lyle goes on a shopping spree and buys thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes. He rents a limousine and a bodyguard before buying a special edition Porsche. Apparently he'd been mad at his father whilst he was alive for not buying him a Porsche, so he buys it himself. He also buys a Rolex watch and a cafe in Princeton. At one point, Lyle travels back home to California and he hires a man called Glenn Stevens, who is a computer expert. He gets Glenn to access Kitty's computer and erase files. Now, these files were the latest versions of Jose and Kitty's wills, in which very little had been left to Lyle and Erik. Lyle told Glenn to ensure that there were no traces of these wills to be found. The older wills bequeathed the entire Menendez fortune to Lyle and Erik. The new, updated wills left them with basically nothing. You see, Jose and Kitty had been at kind of a loss with the boys in the months before their deaths. It dawned on the parents that maybe giving their children every single thing they'd ever desired for their entire life hadn't exactly led to them being well-adjusted adults. They didn't approve of their son's lifestyle choices, and like I said, Lyle was a playboy. He was dating an endless string of women, although he had recently got engaged, like I said, and Erik was seemingly a criminal now. He was bored of his privilege and he had no drive about him. Kitty was particularly upset about her children, and so she takes away both their credit cards to teach them a lesson. But it just wasn't working. To me, it seems like Jose and Kitty wanted complete control of their sons, but their sons pushed back against it and went too far in the opposite direction. And they just became not very great people. It was just constant fighting against one another. So Jose essentially removes his sons from his will in retaliation. Eventually, the police had exhausted every possible lead in this case. There was no mob connection. They looked into Jose's business rivals. They found nothing there. Eventually, they were led to believe that it had to be the brothers, since they had an obvious financial motive and they were spending money like there was no tomorrow. Lyle reportedly spent $700,000 in the first few weeks after his parents were killed. They get one of Erik's friends to wear a wire and they try to entice a confession out of Erik, but there was no luck. 2 months after the murders, Erik and Lyle had their first in-depth interview with the police, which took place in the family's Beverly Hills home. But the police didn't really get much from them. Now, throughout all of this, the boys are still regularly seeing their therapist, Dr. Leon Jerome Azouz, who they've been seeing consistently since the burglary incident the year before. And it would turn out that seeing their therapist would be their downfall. One day, Erik arrives at his office, extremely agitated and depressed. He said that he felt suicidal, he was constantly seeing scenes of his parents' death, and he tells the doctor that he wants to talk, but he doesn't want to talk in the office. So they go for a walk. Erik eventually just says to Azouz, "We did it." Once back at the office, Erik describes in elaborate detail what had happened. According to Azouz, Erik had said that he'd gotten the idea to kill his father when he saw a BBC programme in which the same thing had happened. Erik's watching this TV show and he calls Lyle into the room to watch. He said that his father dominated his entire life, that Jose was cruel and tyrannical, and that him and Lyle would never be able to live up to the standards that Jose had set for them. Jose also bullied their mother. She lived a damaged life. He said that the main reason they killed Kitty as well was because they couldn't find a way to kill Jose without killing her too, as she would be a witness. But Kitty wasn't happy anyway. Now, according to what Erik told Azouz, apparently the brothers bought the shotguns and got fake IDs in preparation. Erik walks in first, shooting their father, with Lyle following behind. Jose died almost instantly after being shot, but Kitty didn't. Kitty's lying on the floor, but the boys have run out of bullets, so they have to leave the room to get more cartridges to reload the gun, before Lyle returns and kills Kitty. Azouz calls Lyle, who comes straight to the office and reportedly accuses Erik of ruining the perfect crime. A couple of days after this, now the 2nd of November 1989, the brothers return for another session with Azouz. This time they return together and it's recorded. They talk more about the murder in detail. Now, unknown to them, Azouz's mistress, a woman called Judalon Smith, was actually in the office that day, and she was listening on the other side of the door. Eventually, she goes to the police and tells them that she has information. When later asked on the witness stand about why Azouz didn't go to the police immediately and tell them of the confession, he said, "I was of the firm belief that Erik and Lyle were planning to murder me." Once the police know of the confessions, they get search warrants for Azouz's tapes, and eventually on March 8th, 1990, Lyle Menendez is arrested. Erik is in Israel at the time at a major tennis tournament, and he returns home 3 days later to turn himself in. Both were held without bail and separated from each other. Now, there was a lot of argument as to whether these tapes would be admissible in court because of the whole patient-doctor confidentiality thing, but they were later ruled to be admissible. They could be played in court. The battle over the tapes actually dragged out for over 13 months before the Supreme Court of California ended up having to intervene. And the entire confession was on these tapes. There was no way around it. And the tapes also confirmed that the 2 shotguns were purchased at a Big 5 sporting goods store on August 18th, 2 days before the murders. It took a while for the investigation team to be sure of this though. They couldn't just take the brothers' word, they needed proof of what had happened. Eventually they find a receipt for the sale of 2 shotguns on August 18th, signed for by a man called Donovan J. Goodrow, who just happened to be one of Lyle's good friends from Princeton. Now, Goodrow was actually in New York City at the time of the purchase, so it couldn't have been him. And the signature and the address given on the receipt weren't his. It was the brothers signing for the guns under Goodrow's name. They'd gone to an effort to cover their tracks. On the 26th of March 1990, the brothers were arraigned for the first-degree murder of their parents with special circumstances. They both pleaded not guilty and they were held without bail pending trial. But once it was ruled that their confession tapes could be played in court, they had no choice but to change their plea to guilty. Their confessions were recorded. On December 7th, 1992, both of them were indicted and tried separately for murder. Over 500 people were questioned and screened to be jurors for this trial, but it was made difficult by the fact that this was a huge case with a huge amount of media attention. They had to find unbiased jurors who didn't know much about the case, and that was very, very difficult. 2 juries are selected, 1 for each brother. So there's to be one trial which the 2 juries are to witness simultaneously, but they're to come to their decisions separately. So in reality, the 2 juries could witness the exact same trial, and the 2 brothers could have been given entirely different verdicts and sentences. So now we're going to look at the trial, and be warned, it's a pretty heavy one. It was actually broadcast on TV in 1993, and all in all, the process went on for years. It went on over the same time as the infamous O.J. Simpson trial, and it was an interesting one because there was no doubt in this case that the boys had murdered their parents. They had confessed and admitted to everything. But what was to be deliberated in this court was the motive, the difference between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter. Now by this point in the story, by the time it actually reached trial, the stories had been out in the public for years. There was no doubt in the public's minds that they'd murdered their parents in cold blood, that they were nothing more than spoilt rich boys who hadn't been getting their own way, so they resorted to murder. The lead prosecutor against the brothers was a woman called Pamela Bosnick, who was determined to see them get the maximum possible sentence for murder, which was the death penalty, death by lethal injection. She argued that their greed motivated them to kill their parents in order to inherit their fortune without any interference. But the defence claimed that the brothers believed that they were in immediate danger of death or bodily injury from their parents at the time of the murder. According to the defence, the brothers were terrified. They'd reportedly heard and seen their parents whispering, locking themselves away in rooms to talk. They thought they'd embarrassed their parents one too many times and that their parents were planning to murder them and do away with the problem. And in their opening statement, the defence dropped a bombshell, something that would go on to change the entire public perception of the case. There were allegations of years of abuse from Kitty and Jose Menendez, physical, mental, and sexual abuse. So we'll go over the prosecution's points first. As Pamela Bosnick said, this is not a prosecution trial, this is a defence trial. The defence has conceded all the prosecution charges. They had to prove that the boys were in immense danger from their parents, and they have to prove sexual molestation. The prosecution began by calling several police officers to the stand as witnesses to describe how Kitty and Jose's bodies were found and the state of the crime scene. Under their testimony, the prosecution asserted that elements of the crime scene indicated that this murder was premeditated. An important part of the prosecution's argument was that the boys had planned this murder, that it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment emotional decision or in self-defence. The fact that they'd gone and bought the shotguns 2 days beforehand proved that this had been planned. The prosecution tried to elicit an emotional reaction from the jurors by placing large photos of the bodies in the courtroom and playing the 911 call made by Lyle. He's questioned about the 911 call. He's obviously lying in this. He's crying on the phone, inconsolable, barely able to get his words out. And the prosecution said that this shows that he's clearly a good liar. He's lying at this point on the phone call. Or maybe he was just genuinely emotional about the death of his parents, despite the fact that he's the one who did it. But if he can be such a convincing liar about this, what else can he be a convincing liar about? And then there's the money. There's varying figures about how much the Menendez family fortune was actually worth, but I think the safe number to go with is around $8 million. And obviously the value of this was a lot higher in the 80s than it is nowadays. Both brothers, particularly Lyle, went on a big shopping spree just days after the murders. Pamela seemed to focus specifically on the purchase of the Rolex watch and the Porsche. The boys couldn't seem to explain these purchases away, other than the fact that they'd just grown up wealthy. This kind of lavish spending was just part of their lifestyle. It only seemed natural for them to spend money when they had it. They never had to think twice about spending money. But a lot of people would probably grieve though after the death of their parents, and the brothers didn't seem to have that issue. They just immediately went out and started spending. And then of course there's Dr. Azouz's testimony. In a really strange twist, Azouz actually ended up testifying for the prosecution and Judalon Smith testified for the defence, despite her being the one to actually turn the boys in. Now I already told you Azouz's version of events earlier in the video, what the boys told them during their therapy sessions together and why he didn't turn himself in. Apparently he was too scared that the boys were going to kill him. Azouz states that during their sessions together he was told of abuse from Jose Menendez, that Jose was mentally and physically abusive, that his sons were scared of him and felt like their entire world was controlled by their father. But he says that at no point do the brothers ever tell him of any sexual abuse. And this was a big part of the prosecution's case. Why would they not tell their therapist of sexual abuse? But as part of the agreement with the doctor when they first went to him after the burglaries, Erik and Lyle were made to sign a waiver of the confidentiality agreement, which essentially meant that Dr. Azouz was able to share what he learned in these therapy sessions with Jose and Kitty. Jose wanted to know what was said in these sessions, so he made his son sign the waiver. And it seems unlikely that the brothers would share any sexual abuse with the psychiatrist, knowing that the psychiatrist would likely go back and tell their parents. Most doctors, of course, would not agree to this in the first place, but Jose probably kept searching until he found a doctor that did. And the defence used this as one of their ways to discredit Azouz as a doctor. He actually ended up spending 6 days on the stand being questioned, until eventually it got to the point where people were wondering if it was the Menendez brothers on trial or if it was Dr. Azouz himself. Azouz's conduct was brought into question because of the fact that his medical licence was actually suspended at the time he was hired by the Menendezes. The prosecution also called Erik's best friend, Craig Signorelli, to the stand, where Craig speaks of a screenplay that Erik wrote titled Friends. Erik and Craig wrote a lot of screenplays together. In Friends, the spoilt son of a wealthy couple goes on to commit 5 murders, the first of which are his parents, in an attempt to inherit $157 million. Now you can see how Erik writing this screenplay may have shadowed his own actions. 4 weeks into the trial, the prosecution finally rests their case, and they're followed by the defence. The defence included calling Lyle and Erik to the stands themselves. Now Lyle says that himself and Erik killed their parents because they were afraid. He says on the stand for the first time that his father molested and raped him when he was a young boy.
Did your father have sexual contact with you?
Yes.
And how did it start?
Just started with, after sports practices, he would massage me, and we would have these talks, and he would show me, and he would fondle me, and he would ask me to do the same with him, and I would touch him, and we would undress.
Where would this take place?
In my bedroom.
And how often would this happen?
Like 2 or 3 times a week.
And for how long did this happen?
Not too long. It began to change.
When did it begin to change?
I'm not sure exactly at what time, but almost close to when I was 7.
And how did it change?
Just became more involved.
What do you mean more involved?
We would be in the bathroom, and he would put me on my knees, and he would guide me, all my movements, and I would have oral sex with him.
Did you want to do this? At some point, did he do some other things to you?
Yes.
Did you ask him not to?
Yes.
How did you ask him not to?
I just told him, I don't. I just told him that I didn't want to do this, and that it hurt me.
Personally, I find it really hard not to believe him here. It definitely elicits an emotional reaction. I'm well aware of the fact that this could be a lie, that they could be using the sexual abuse claim to lessen their sentence. but there's just something about the raw emotion coming from Lyle here that I don't really think could be faked. There were reportedly journalists in the room waiting for the moment details about this alleged sexual abuse came out, just waiting to rip it to shreds in the newspapers. But these journalists start crying. But of course, not all the media believed them. There was the media who mocked them for their emotional breakdowns on the stand. Saturday Night Live actually imitated them in a very dark sketch in October 1993. Erik is also called to the stand, where he talks in depth about the motivation behind the murder, how it was ultimately him that started the chain of events that led to it. Lyle's sexual abuse had lasted for 2 to 3 years when he was a child, under the age of 10, and then it had stopped. But unknown to Lyle, their father had simply moved on to Erik instead, and this lasted for years, up until Jose's eventual death. Erik recounts on the stand how he finally told Lyle about what was happening. According to him, Lyle and Kitty had had a huge argument the week before the murders, where she ended up ripping Lyle's toupee off his head. Erik was shocked. He had no idea that his brother wore a toupee. And it turned out that Jose actually forced him to wear one because the hair on Lyle's head was thinning. And this led to a very emotional conversation between the two brothers, where Erik breaks down and admits to Lyle that their father had been sexually abusing him. Lyle confronts Jose and threatens to tell the police, but the way that Jose responded to these threats led Lyle to believe that he was going to kill both of his sons. This was the catalyst, according to them, that led to the eventual murder of their parents the very next week. And this was kind of a turnaround point for the jury, who just seemed very unsure of what to believe. The whole story was very believable, but the prosecution said that they'd fabricated the story as an emotional motive for murder. One of the brothers' cousins actually took the stand and testified that when Lyle was 8 years old and she was 17, Lyle confided in her about the alleged sexual abuse. She said that he asked if he could sleep in with her that night because he was afraid to sleep in his own bed because his father had been touching him down there. The cousin told Kitty, who didn't believe her, and it just seems like the story ended there. The cousin just kind of forgot about it. And the prosecution also brought up the argument that Erik was supposedly homosexual and that was the true source of contention between him and his father. The defence objected to this, but it seems like this is something that the media may have latched onto. It was mentioned in many of the articles I read about this case, Erik's supposed homosexuality. And to be honest, I don't really see its relevance to this case, but the prosecution pushed this as far as they could. The prosecution was basically trying to argue that the reason Erik and his father didn't get on was because Erik was gay, and that had nothing to do with sexual abuse at all. But I really don't know where the basis to this claim is. I don't know why they seem to push this so far. When questioned as to why the brothers wouldn't just leave the home if this kind of abuse was taking place, they said that despite everything, they still loved their parents, and it was all they'd ever known. They didn't have anywhere else to go. They didn't know how to live their lives without their parents' support and their wealth. The sexual abuse allegations were a very difficult one. The alleged abuser was dead, and there was no physical or medical evidence. There was no way to confirm it either way. The jury just had to take the boys at their word. But how do you believe double murderers? And there remains a question of why would they kill their mother as well? Eventually the case comes to a close, and the judge rules that no reasonable person would have been in fear of their parents in the situation described in court. So the self-defense defense is ruled out, and the juries are sent to decide the brothers' degree of guilt, first degree or second degree murder. The juries deliberate separately for 3 weeks. In Erik's case, the jury comes back on the 10th of January in 1994 to announce that they're deadlocked. They cannot come to a decision, and they declare a mistrial. 2 weeks later, Lyle's jury returns with the same result. So it has to begin all over again. Now, the second trial was much less publicised. The public had kind of got bored because this time the judge didn't allow cameras in the room. It wasn't the media circus it was the first time round. And also during this second trial, there wasn't much defence testimony allowed about the sexual abuse claims, which I do find very strange. Now, there's no way of knowing for sure if the sexual abuse did happen or not, but if it did, I think it makes a pretty legitimate defence, and it makes a big difference in this case. The judge also didn't allow the jury to vote on manslaughter charges instead of murder charges, so regardless, these boys were going down for murder. It wasn't until April 17th, 1996 that a third and final jury found the brothers guilty. All in all, the process took nearly 7 years. They were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit a murder, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on July 2nd, 1996. They were spared the death penalty because they had no criminal record or history of violence before the murders, and the judge made a point of saying that the abuse defence was not a factor in his deliberations on this. The jury had decided that they committed the murders in order to inherit the father's wealth only, that there was no aspect of self-defence at all. The brothers were separated and sent to different prisons in California, both of them considered maximum security inmates. But they remained close, they wrote regularly, and they both remained very active in prison life. Erik would spend time with terminally ill prisoners, and Lyle was president of the inmate government for more than 15 years, and he ran a support group for prisoners who had endured childhood sexual abuse, and they both married during their incarceration as well. And they appealed many times, of course, but their conviction has always been upheld. In February of last year, so 2018, Lyle was moved from Mule Creek State Prison in Northern California down to the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County, the same prison as Erik. They were kept in different units until the April, when they were moved to the same unit, and they had an emotional reunion. The first time they'd seen each other since the beginning of their sentence 22 years earlier. The housing is actually reserved for well-behaved inmates who agree to participate in educational and rehabilitation programs. So there's the very highly requested story of the Menendez brothers, and I cannot wait to hear all of your opinions in the comments. I think it's going to be a very divisive one. Personally, I don't know where I stand. I'm inclined to believe the sexual abuse stories, but maybe it's just because I like to believe the best in people. Either way, there's no denying that they killed their parents regardless of the motive. Do you believe that there is ever a good enough motive for murder? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below if there are any other similar cases that you would like me to cover. I actually found this quite an interesting one to research. It's very different from the usual kind of things I read about, so I'd be intrigued to see if there are any more similar to this. Make sure you subscribe to my channel. In the top line of my description, you'll find my Patreon and my merch store if you would like to go check those out. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.